millions of containers of hazardous materials. But how do they get from the manufacturer to the people who use them? What's the safest method of hauling hazardous materials? That's what this short training program is all about. We're going to explain how the shipping process works, what regulations guide you through the shipping process, and some other useful information. The goal is to make you aware of hazardous materials and the proper shipping procedures. Let's first explain that the U.S. Postal Service does not ship hazardous materials. They do have some exceptions to this rule, but generally you cannot ship any hazardous materials through the United States Postal Service. Other carriers such as UPS, FedEx, and others generally require a contract with the shipping company, so it's best to verify each of these organizations' requirements for shipping hazardous materials. The majority of hazardous materials is shipped via trucking companies, but no matter with whom you ship, you must follow proper procedures and the Department of Transportation regulations relating to hazardous materials. This training program will help provide information relating to these regulations and how to determine the proper shipping methods. At the end of this training program, we'll provide the name and address of the University of Texas, which has agreed to provide you additional information or assist you in determining proper shipping methods. Their service is free of charge to companies who have purchased this program. Of course, always follow your company's policies and procedures. First things first, so let's quickly explain the definition of hazardous materials. Hazardous materials means a substance or material which has been determined by the U.S. Department of Transportation to be capable of posing an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce, and which has been so designated as hazardous material. The term includes hazardous substances, hazardous wastes, marine pollutants, and elevated temperature materials, and materials that meet the defining criteria for hazard classes. While we're talking about hazard classes, let's review them quickly. Hazard class means the category of hazard assigned to a hazardous material. Class 1 is explosives. Within the Class 1 classification, there are several divisions of different types of explosives. Class 2 is gases. This includes flammable gases, non-flammable, toxic gases. Class 3 is reserved for flammable and combustible liquids. Class 4 is for flammable solids, spontaneously combustible materials, and dangerous when wet materials. Class 5 is oxidizers and organic peroxides. Class 6 is for toxic materials and infectious substances. Poisons are listed in this hazard classification. Class 7 is radioactive materials. Class 8 is for corrosive materials. Class 9 is for miscellaneous dangerous goods. Before we proceed, it's time to introduce you to two important books. They contain regulations, information about chemicals and hazardous materials, where to find help, and a lot more. First, the United States Code of Federal Regulations for Transportation. It's called 49 CFR, with parts 100 to 185. It contains the United States regulations relating to the transportation of hazardous materials and other regulations. You need to have one of these books if you intend to transport or ship hazardous materials. Next, the North American Emergency Response Guidebook. It's a guide for first responders during the initial phase of a hazardous materials, dangerous goods incident. It's used in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. This valuable book provides emergency information in these three countries: the hazard classification system, placarding system, guide numbers indexed to names of materials, and names of materials indexed to guide numbers. There is also information related to mixed loads and unidentified cargo, explosive gases, flammables, and instructions and guides for spills or leaks of hazardous materials. Additional information is available for protective actions, personal protective equipment, and much more. This book should be available for anyone who transports or ships hazardous materials, including the shipper of these materials. To make the learning process a bit more easy, we've chosen a 1-gallon can of paint to be shipped from one location to another. Can it be sent in the U.S. mail? Or what mode of transportation must be used? We turn to the 49 CFR, looking on the Hazardous Materials Table 172.101 for paint. There are several columns of information that will help us determine what methods may be used to ship this 1-gallon can of paint. You can see there are several columns, so we first go to Paint, column 2. This column is the hazardous materials descriptions and proper shipping names. Column 3 for paint reveals it is in Hazard Class 3. Column 4 shows the identification numbers. In this case, it is UN 1263. Column 5 is the PG or packing groups assigned to a material corresponding to the proper shipping name and hazard class. In this case, our paint is the PG number 1. Packing groups 1, 2, and 3 indicate the degree of danger presented by the material. Be sure to study each column in Subpart B, the table of hazardous materials and special provisions. Additional detailed information regarding provisions of each column are found here. If you're not sure of something listed in a column, you can find more detailed information in Subpart B. Column 6 is Label Codes. This column specifies codes which represent the hazard warning labels required for a package filled with a material conforming to the hazard class, proper shipping name, and other information. In this case, the label code for paint is 3. If the paint were corrosive, as identified in column 2, you can see that the label code would be 8, which indicates corrosive. Label code 3 indicates a flammable liquid. Just this small difference in identification can mean a totally different method of shipping and handling. This should put you on notice that it is extremely important to properly identify the material or substance you are shipping before you do anything else. Column 7 specifies codes for special provisions. You'll have to go to paragraph 172.102 of Subpart B for the meaning and requirements for these hazardous materials. Our can of paint has several provisions. It's important to read each provision carefully, as each provision has different meanings and requirements. In section 172.102 of the 49 CFR, it explains each of the provision codes. The letter A refers to the special provision, which applies only to transportation by aircraft. Letter B applies only to bulk packaging requirements, and so on. The letter T, in our case, refers to the provision of only to the transportation in portable tanks. Since we're only shipping 1 gallon of paint in a can, the T provision does not apply. If we were shipping this paint in portable tanks, then these codes would apply. Column 8 is for packaging authorizations. There are 3 subcolumns. Subcolumn 8A is for packaging exceptions. 8B is non-bulk requirements, and 8C is for bulk packaging. Simply go to the subpart, paragraph 173, and determine these packaging requirements or exceptions. Let's explain bulk and non-bulk a bit more. Non-bulk packaging means a package which has a maximum capacity of 450 liters or 119 gallons or less as a receptacle for a liquid. A maximum net mass of 400 kilograms or 882 pounds or less, and a maximum capacity of 450 liters or 119 gallons or less as a receptacle for a solid, or a water capacity of 454 kilograms or 1,000 pounds or less as a receptacle for a gas. Column 9 indicates the quantity limitations of the mode of transportation. In the case of our paint can, only 1 liter of paint can be transported in a passenger aircraft or rail car. If it's being shipped by cargo aircraft, then up to 30 liters of packaging group 1 material may be shipped by this method. A special provision may allow different shipping parameters. Each of these columns are important, so be sure you fully understand the information in each column as it relates to your hazardous material. Column 10 is the vessel stowage with two subcolumns. 10A is stowage location and 10B is other. It looks like a lot of detailed work to go through that whole process. It is somewhat complex, but it's critical that you follow the proper regulations when shipping any hazardous material. After you have been working with the book and tables for a while, it will seem much easier, but no less important. We didn't even touch on column 1, so let's do that now. Column 1 of the table contains 5 symbols: a plus sign, the letters A, D, I, and W. The plus sign fixes the proper shipping name, hazard class, and packing group for that entry without regard to whether the material meets the definition of that class or packing group or meets any other hazard class definition. An appropriate alternative proper shipping name and hazard class may be authorized by the Associate Administrator for Hazardous Materials Safety within the Department of Transportation. The letter A restricts the application of this material to be offered or intended for transportation by aircraft, unless the material is a hazardous substance or a hazardous waste. The letter D identifies proper shipping names which are appropriate for describing materials for domestic transportation, but may be inappropriate for international transportation. The letter I identifies proper shipping names which are appropriate for describing materials in international transportation. The letter W restricts the application of this material to be offered or intended for transportation by vessel unless the material is a hazardous substance or hazardous waste. Okay, any questions? Have we finished the project? No, there's more. After completing all the information from the hazardous materials table for paint, the next step is to prepare a bill of lading or shipping paper. This also includes emergency response information in case the paint spills during transportation. In the United States, the Department of Transportation requires that you train every 3 years. In the case of shipping by aircraft, training every 2 years is required. This training should include general awareness, specific job functions, and of course, safety. Hazmat training should include the following: general awareness and familiarization training. Each hazmat employee must be provided this type of training to understand and be familiar with requirements, regulations, and be able to properly identify hazardous materials. Each hazmat employee must receive safety training in emergency response information, methods and procedures for avoiding accidents. This includes the proper procedures for handling packages containing hazardous materials. There must be initial training and recurrent training. Initial training means a new hazmat employee or a hazmat employee who changes job functions may perform those functions prior to the completion of training if these provisions are provided. The employee performs those functions under the direct supervision of a properly trained and knowledgeable hazmat employee, and the training is completed within 90 days after employment or a change in job function. Recurrent training must be provided every 3 years or 2 years in the case of shipping via air. Those employees who were trained with another employer or other source may be used to satisfy training requirements, provided a current record of training is obtained from hazmat employee's previous employer. Without the training record documentation, then new training is required. Records and documentation are extremely important. Let's review the record-keeping requirements. A record of current training, inclusive of the preceding 3 years, must be maintained. The employer is required to maintain these records while the employee is employed by the employer and for 90 days thereafter. As outlined in paragraph 172.704 of the 49 CFR, the training record must include the following information: hazmat employee's name, the most recent training completion date of hazmat employee's training, a description, copy, or the location of the training materials used to meet the requirements listed in paragraph 172.704D2, the name and address of the person providing the training, certification that the hazmat employee has been trained and tested as required. In the beginning of the program, we mentioned the University of Texas, who has agreed to provide free consultation and information relating to shipping of hazardous materials. They may be contacted at their training center in Houston, Texas. Shipping of hazardous materials is a big responsibility. There have been many disasters and lives lost due to improper shipping of hazardous materials. Take the time to research the regulations to make sure you have the proper packaging, labels, placarding, and the proper mode of transportation. If you're not sure about something, ask questions. It's all about safety. Thank you.